So there I would see 3 or 4 different types or levels of fragmentation that have grown and where more coordination is needed in the future. Then finally, final point here, Jada, then in respect to the trends of democratic renewal in Europe, we also can identify several levels at which stronger coordination is needed. It is needed between protest social movements and formal CSOs. It's needed between some of the key themes that have emerged in recent years. I would suggest in particular in relation to the climate agenda and the democracy agenda. These two very, very prominent areas of activism don't always sit entirely easily together, nor are they completely in sync with each other. We need more coordination between deliberative forums, citizen assemblies on the one hand, and civil society organizations on the other hand. These assemblies are making more efforts to link into parliamentary activity, but they've still been bad at building downward links to the civic sphere. We need more coordination between online and offline civic activism. The new phase of online activism seems to be very focused on online rights that doesn't speak often to the kinds of more traditional offline forms of activism. So another breach seems to be opening up there. We need more coordination between the civic sphere and the political sphere. The attempts of newer kinds of parties to build links and incorporate newer types of civic dynamics have not succeeded to the extent that one would have hoped a decade ago. We need more coordination between local, national, and EU levels. Activism at these 3 different levels can still be rather disconnected, very commonly. The Conference on the Future of Europe still needs to speak downwards to the kinds of local concerns driving activism at the community level. The EU reform agenda, it seems to me, is still rather disconnected from citizens' day-to-day concerns. And arguably, we need to build links between different ideological perspectives within civil society as well. It may be that one does not agree with some of the less liberal or more conservative, less progressive areas of civil society, but these do represent a legitimate part of civil society. And in order to help narrow the polarization that has grown in recent years, arguably links do need to be built, and coordination, at least where it might be possible, needs to be explored between these different ideological perspectives in civil society. So I will conclude there, Giada. What I basically try to do is say, yes, of course we need more coordination, but we also need a better division of labor between these different types of activism. Not all types of activism do need to be coordinated. The kind of pluralism we've seen in tactics and aims in many ways is a good thing. We need the competition for ideas. There will not be one model or template of civic reform or democratic reform in the future. What we have seen in recent years is the emergence of a healthy mix of different forms of action and democracy. But we do need to, I think, to explore ways of at least making sure that people with the same aims in mind do pull together, and that there's the right kind of balance between these different types of activism and political action. And for me, I think I would frame the challenge of coordination in those terms.
Thanks a lot, Richard, for all this input. I see that there is already some reaction in the chat box. Please feel free to use it. And also don't forget about the insights, because we can continue the discussion in the small groups. I think that you have identified some quite important lines of division where we can strengthen our convergence and see how we can better work together. And to explore this, we have the pleasure to have with us 2 speakers that will give us insight on how 2 important contemporary movements, the Black Lives Matter and the protest movement in Slovenia, are reflecting on these issues and working around the tensions that emerge. The first one is Julie Pascoët, Senior Advocacy Officer at the European Network Against Racism, ENAR, who is going to tell us about their work to bring demands of the Black Lives Matter movement from the streets to the European institutions. And then we will have Jenull, one of the initiators of the Friday protest in Slovenia. These are protests that have been ongoing for roughly 1.5 years against the conservative anti-rights government currently in power, but it's much more than that, and we will hear about that. Julie, let's start with you. In the last year, we have witnessed an unprecedented massive mobilization against the systemic racism globally and also in Europe under the slogan Black Lives Matter. The mobilization has made visible the long-term organizing of people of color. And in the US, the movement was so strong that was able to unite the opposition and different democratic demands. In Europe too, we have seen that it sparked a debate on the issue of systemic racism. And for example, the calls that have been voiced by NGOs, the NGO delegation at the Conference on the Future of Europe for a more diverse and representative participation is one example. But we also still need to progress a lot. And in order to look at our own European issues with these, with the systemic racism. So I would like to hear from you, what were the effects of the movement becoming so high in the mass media, on the public and also on the civil society? In other words, how are other types of civil society and movements approaching the movement and the issue more general of racial justice?
Thank you very much, Jada, for these questions and for inviting me and representing ENAR to this audience. So I just want to say that I'm working in the Secretariat of the European Network Against Racism, which is a network of more than 180 organizations working on anti-racism in Europe. So, of course, 2020 has been a turning moment for us. And when it comes to the effects and how the stakeholders have been relating to the movement and to racial justice, I could highlight several. First one is actually there has been a new sense and a recovered sense of power and agency from racialized groups that are among the most marginalized communities in Europe. We have seen how spontaneous grassroots mobilization, even sometimes beyond organized movement, organized civil society, how powerful they were, and really the power of the streets, as we say. And actually, because it was unplanned, coming directly from the needs of communities, and by that showing the emergency actually to act and the emergency of the situation. And actually this has really showed the power of people, as I said, beyond institutions, beyond the people in power. And it has given much more strength and power to racialized groups to be able to claim what they wanted to claim and all the issues they have been raising for so long. Also showing that power is not only about institutional power. It's also about having positive impact on our communities. It's about being able to mitigate the impact of institutional racism that can be discriminatory, and be able to change the system by proposing something radically different. A second element when it comes to effects is that the Black Lives Matter movement and all the impact in Europe has lifted to some extent the taboo in Europe, especially in high-level policy-making circles. for example, has been the first time where in the president of the commission, in her speech and in the EU anti-racism action plan that had been adopted some time afterwards, actually where it was the first time where structural racism, institutional racism was actually mentioned. So really like a high level institution acknowledging, especially at EU level, acknowledging that institutions themselves, states themselves can also be perpetrating racism. And this was the first time recognition of this. And we would never have had such a political recognition and commitment without Black Lives Matter movement and all the protests in Europe. And ENAR has been calling for many demands for a long time, solutions such as equality data disaggregated by race, national action plan against racism, addressing police violence, even at the borders, diversity strategies in institutions. But you know, the taboo in racism had been so deep that we could also see that our approach has limitations, and without a grassroots movement, without the streets, we cannot really increase this recognition at institutional level. We cannot also get the institutions themselves to acknowledge the historical legacy of Europe when it comes to exclusion of racialized people. And finally, I would just mention in terms of effects, we have seen that, and I think it has been mentioned already, a lot of stakeholders have engaged in kind of introspections and trying to implement action plan and strategies to actually look into their own practices and see how they can mainstream racial justice in their work. For example, Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust as a foundation has a program looking at from where their money is coming from, trying to tackle power and privileges. Amnesty is also working on trying to implement a comprehensive, holistic anti-racism strategy. The European Digital Rights movement is trying also to have a decolonization process. So we see that a lot of stakeholders have used this momentum to also first admit that there was a gap in their approach when it comes to racial justice, and trying to implement some very concrete policies in this.
Thanks, Julie. You already kind of mentioned some reflection around my second question for you, about also the effects within the racial justice movement. What are the different strategies inside the movement, and how are different actors in the movement looking and adopting these strategies?
Yeah, so I think this 2020 movement also brought a wider question about the kind of strategy when it comes to trying to influence systemic change. Should we do it inside the system or outside the system? Considering the growing, I mean, as I was mentioning, we are an institutional and professional NGO working on anti-racism. This has also shown some limitations, and also for us trying to question and having some strategic thinking on how also we can go beyond that. Because can we really address systemic inequalities when we are trying to also not being too radical towards the system in place, in order to keep relationships, to keep influence, to keep funding. So there is also, I think, what 2020 has shown also is the limit of institutional mobilization. How can we have a better balance? Also, how can we have a better connection and better balance between this institutional aspect of our work and the grassroots and a more radical aspect of the work, which is actually crucial, because what we see now is that we need a systemic change. It's not just a cosmetic change. And so can we really do it in the current in the current framework? Can we really mobilize this way? And I think there is also a paradox in our work, is that we are trying to now address institutional racism, and it's being recognized by the very institutions that are perpetrating racism. So at the same time, there is this recognition, there is this from some actors, this questioning on privileges. But at the same time, we have never seen so much opposition to that. I think also the impact on human rights defenders and the attacks from some government is also a testament to that. And another strategy that is also being used is how can we be more intersectional in our organizing, beyond group-based organizing, especially when it comes to anti-racism, which tends to also organize around identities or groups. How can we, I think one of the gap is also the fact that we focus on group-based organizing, on group-based issues, for example, is sometimes leading us to actually not tackling the system, the oppression system in place. And it's not about hierarchy, it's not about losing the focus on some issues, on some manifestation. It's really about having a more comprehensive approach to inequalities, more structural approach to inequalities. And I really think that intersectionality is one of the tools that can really push us to more convergence, to a deeper and more complex understanding of inequalities and how and what kind of systemic solutions we can put in place.
One of the working group actually will delve also into this issue of intersectionality, and but I think that this will emerge probably from all the discussions. You have already mentioned some of these, but you are in a very privileged position to interface both the grassroots demands and the ways of organizing, and also the institutions, their bureaucratic approach to the issue of racism. I can imagine that this sometimes creates tensions, and I'm wondering what these are and how you navigate them.
Yeah, so I was mentioning the tensions of working with sometimes with some institutions, and it has become very much more acute lately. And when it comes to attacks on human rights defenders, I mean, for the first time in our history, one of our members have been dissolved back in December, the Collective Against Islamophobia in France. And one of the arguments was that CCIF was actually denouncing institutional or state Islamophobia. So basically, yeah, as I was mentioning, institutional racism, that is, of course, like questioning the institution in place. And there has been several other cases of NGOs dissolved in France based on this accusation. And not only that, but we have also seen other examples in the last few months on governments trying to dissolve organizations and organizations that are actually questioning these state practices. So this is really a big issue that we have at the moment. Because if you really want to move forward, as I was mentioning, and questioning the system, as questioning and really like not being satisfied to just superficial or cosmetic or ad hoc demands and changes, then we need to be much more, we need to go much deeper. But then how do we do it? How do we do it without funding, without allies in institutions? How do we do it without people in power? So this is really something that we are really questioning ourselves. And that's also where I think alliances, much broader alliances in civil society is really needed. Another tension also is about the fragmented approach that I was mentioning. And this is also needs to be much more like overcome when it comes to especially anti-racism, but also broader social justice issues. And I was and one way to do it is also to understand how to mainstream it in the work, and And I think one of the tension is how do we keep the momentum now that institutions, now that civil society, now that, you know, mainstream stakeholders are really trying to include racial justice in their approach. But how do we ensure that it's not simply a trend? How do we ensure that it's not just buzzwords, like, for example, intersectionality has been? How do we ensure that it's not depoliticized and that it's really about tackling structural change? So are these organizations providing resources for communities? Are there specific policies put in place? Are there safe space for racialized groups? Are there meaningful involvement of racialized groups or civil society representing them? I think these are really also key questions that we should ask. And I will just would like to end by also saying that indeed, I mean, we cannot, we need to understand also in the anti-racist movement that we cannot tackle racism and structural racism without connecting to the other oppressions. And that's also where is the challenge. So how do we build true coalitions and true alliances in order to support each other and to connect and to understand that all our oppressions are actually connected?
Thanks. You gave us a lot to reflect about, and I'm sure that everybody is taking in and processing. Please don't forget about these points that were raised, because they will be important for the discussion following the plenary. Now I would like, Jasa, are you here?
Yes,
yes. I am. I couldn't see you. So Jasa comes from Slovenia, where following the coming to power of a regressive political government, we saw also a revitalization of civic activism, and probably the most visible of this most visible aspect of this revitalization is the ongoing protests that have been happening week after week for over 1.5 years. But this protest has also having more wider changes in the civil society and creating a space also for convergence of agendas as we approach the elections. So Jasa, thanks for being with us. As one of the initiators of the protest, what is the kind of change that the protest would like to see in Slovenia?
Yeah, the protest started, as you said, like approximately a good 1.5 years ago. There have been more than 80 protests, usually on Friday evenings or every Friday evening for the last 80 Fridays. The main kind of how to say impetus for the protest, the main gathering point was the fact that the government that we got suddenly at the start of the pandemic was not elected. It was not the government that the people wanted. The only reason that this extreme right-wing Janez Janša and his party became actually the prime minister of Slovenia was that the people in parliament, representatives in parliament, betrayed the voters because they promised they will not go into coalition with him, and then when it should be early elections, they decided to form a coalition. So the first demand of ours was always that we want early elections and that we want democratic elections. And the other thing was, of course, why we wanted, because since the first week that they took power, it was obvious that they plan on attacking the freedom of the press, of the media, that they plan to attack the independence of the courts, of the police. And in general, there was corruption affairs coming already in the first several weeks, many corruption scandals connected with the buying of this safety equipment during the COVID times and so on. And yeah, it started as a kind of, just as a kind of spontaneous protest that happened in the beginning, especially when it became really massive. It was on bicycles. It was called the bicycle protests, because of keeping the safety distance between people during this COVID times. It was a kind of effective way of combining these two things. But yeah, as time moved on, we also saw the limitations of this protest, which at the maximum there was more than 40,000 people protesting in the streets in Ljubljana. But yeah, which is for Slovenian size, it's an incredible number that maybe there was 1 or 2 protests in the whole history of Slovenia that there was more people. But we saw the limitations of this protest. The government did not want to resign, make early elections. Nobody has been held responsible for all of the many scandals and stuff. So gradually we realized that we need to kind of restructure this spontaneous protests into a kind of long-term movement with some kind of different goals and objectives and way of sustaining this energy going.
And this brings me naturally to my second question, which is how does the movement in the street cooperate with other forms of civic organizing, including NGOs, lawyers, and others? And what are some of the lessons that we can draw?
Yeah, so I think since the very beginning, it was a very dispersed movement. There was anarchist collectives that were very actively involved in the first protest. Very soon, also all the NGOs dealing with environmentalist actions joined actively. Cultural NGOs, or anyway in Slovenia, traditionally kind of have this role of being critical of the government and somewhat progressive in social views and so on. So yeah, since the very beginning, it was a kind of multifaceted cooperation. But yeah, even I think the main, for us, of course, the main, lesson is that, of course, it helps to have it sounds kind of maybe problematic, but it helps to have a very clear common enemy. Yeah, it helps to have one person, and this government, with what it's doing in the way that it was attacking all sectors of society, of course, made it very logical that we all need to join forces. The whole civil society needs to join forces. And yeah, in the months that followed, there was even we have now a newly established network for the protection of legal rights, which is especially focused on helping protesters or activists which are being faced with fines and other kind of pressures from the government. And also we've involved the syndicates, which have also joined the movement and been active participants on protest on specific topics and so on. And a good example of this was maybe when the government decided to change the law on water. So they wanted basically to kind of open the door to privatization of this access to water. And it was, a very successful kind of convergence of whole of Slovenia, which led to the fact that there was a referendum that we managed to organize, and that all this organization came together, that to the point where 83% of the population, of the voters on the referendum, said no to this new law for water. And it was a kind of really big show of the power, because the main question before the referendum is if we will even get enough votes, if we will mobilize enough of the population that the referendum will count. And we, I think, surprised everybody. There was 674,000 people voting, which is, again, in a country of 2 million, it's a kind of big number for, it's, I think, the most voted on referendum, or the second most. So yeah, these collaborations have been organizing themselves basically in reaction to the concrete actions of the government. But of course, as I said, we are also trying to kind of think about how to, and it's a quite difficult transition, I think, from just having spontaneous protests, between just thinking where you will go and what kind of slogans and who will be the speakers, to then kind of try to move this into more of a movement, which should have a kind of whole different organizational structure and work much more long term. But we are trying to make this transition now. And as we said, yeah, the limitations of this protesting, especially in a country which has gone so far as Slovenia, is clear. We are kind of at the moment not anymore very hopeful that there will be early elections, but we also know, yeah, that in April, hopefully next year, there will be regular elections if the government doesn't decide to cancel them. So we now decided to really focus our energy and the energy of the civil society into building a really strong front, which we are calling the voice of the people, and to connect all these different actors with the concrete, very concrete demands that we are putting to all political parties that plan to take part in the next election. So we are making a list of 10 main flagship demands, and then there is 100 demands, like 10 from each of the main areas of society, where we have like organizations from each field, culture, environment, social rights, and so on, human rights, working specifically on these demands. And kind of we are trying to take this moment of crisis as an opportunity. There is also a situation in Slovenia where in general, the people are getting quite apathic, you know, quite despondent with the whole situation. There is a lot of mistrust of politics in general and of all parties, also the opposition, because of course they also were not able to really kind of be effective in this last year and a half. And we feel that in this moment, by making some very concrete goals, common demands, it is an opportunity to connect this civil society activists and individuals from whole Slovenia, and also put pressure on the opposition, on the political parties, to kind of seriously engage with these demands and take them as part of their program and take responsibility for really going through with them.
Thanks for sharing a little bit the reflections that are happening inside the movement. You have already, to an extent, mentioned this, but I wanted to conclude with the last question. Do you see the protest and this resistance changing the landscape of the civil society and becoming a space for longer term convergence, like even beyond the current government?
Yeah, exactly. This was also one of the lessons learned from this referendum for water, where we had a very big mobilization also of volunteers, activists, and so on. But after it, somehow there was no thought put into it what will happen after this referendum. And now we are really trying to make these preparations for the elections in a way that it's part of an ongoing process, that we have contacts from all the people who are involved, and that we are taking it. Hopefully it will become a long-term, very loose alliance where we are not dealing really with the kind of putting too much focus on the structure, on the legal aspect of it. It's just more about like really having a network of communication where information can travel very quickly between this all these different actors, and where we can coordinate very fast. And I think this is the main aim of it. And yeah, the idea is to keep it as a ongoing project or actor in the Slovenian political space.
Thank Jasa, Julie, and Richard for having shared with us all of this input, and thanks for the participants that were very patient in listening to us. Now we are surprisingly on time, and we are going to be split into groups to take some of the reflections that we just heard and delve deeper into some of the topics that were raised. So my colleague Vladimir will send us, and we will come back in roughly one hour and 20 minutes to hear what was the reflection in the small groups.
sort of share knowledge around a specific theme, and how that kind of ethic of care also underlies how they work together as a coalition. And Jasa also mentioned how in Slovenia, a lot of what the movement does is sort of like take care of protesters who might be repressed by police and have like all of these sort of like different issues. So that's an ethic that also informs what we do as organizations. The other thing that we discussed was how then this differs depending on different geographical contexts and what might be the role of the welfare state here, and also different cultures around how we think of care. So we didn't resolve that question, but we raised it. And I think that what was interesting was, for instance, Rafaela mentioned how in Italy, the notion of care has also been associated with Catholicism, and particularly with sort of like the theology of liberation, and how it also informs, you know, from Latin America, also more sort of like indigenous fights around the environment and rights and all of that. So, you know, depending on the context, you can see the notion of care sort of like taking a difference, which we thought was also interesting. And finally, there were sort of like critical questions around whether care as a notion is enough for us to work together and to think of us as interdependent, and to understand that, you know, the win of another is a win for our cause as well, whether it sort of like creates that connection on that deeper level. What is necessary there? We didn't resolve that question, but we discussed it, and we said we need to meet over wine to do that in more detail. So, I mean, I'm not sure whether I'm forgetting something. I tried to put it in some kind of order.
Thank you. In any case, I was about to say, I forgot to mention, if you have questions about the summaries right now, please put them in the chat box and we'll pick them from there and ask our hosts to answer them at the end. So I give now the floor to Elisa or Andrea. I don't know who wants to present also in a couple of minutes, very shortly, the findings.
I'll do. Thank you. So in our workshop, we started off by presenting the European Alliance for Just Transition that SOLIDAR launched recently, for which we're happy to share the link in the chat in a second. And this was the starting point for a conversation about what are the main challenges, difficulties, and issues that one may encounter when trying to launch or join such a large alliance. So we discussed the method, but also the topics that could gather different stakeholders around a same campaign. And in this sense, there were different challenges that were mentioned, also examples from past experiences, positive and less positive ones. And in terms of challenges, for instance, this spanned from the controversy that might come for a member-based organization in terms of having their members rallying behind finding the common denominator for a campaign, but then once this is identified, on the other hand, this being a strength for campaigning very solidly in a unified manner behind it. And then we also discussed, this was discussed quite at length, I would say, the involvement or not of politicians since the very beginning of the campaign. And we agreed that in the end, this depends very much on what kind of campaign we're talking about, but there were some examples showing that for some alliances and campaign, it's very useful to involve them since the very beginning. And in general, participants agreed that it is always a positive idea to involve, at least in a listening mode, politicians and political actors in order to make them feel heard, so that later, at a later stage, they can be more willing to engage with the campaign and support it, bring it into the institutions to help bringing about change. On the other hand, there was the idea that was shared that when it's a matter of campaigning for systemic change, then it's much harder to have them on board since the beginning. And it is important to maintain this very bottom-up, grassroots-led direction for a campaign and alliance. And the example of Black Lives Matter was brought about in this sense, for instance. In terms of ways forward, if you can put it like that, for sure, the idea was shared that it is important to start mainstreaming as much as we can an intersectional approach. And in this sense, also, we discussed broad alliances, also broad in terms of topics that and inclusiveness that an alliance can be able to contain and carry on. And also the issues, the topics of democratic participation for all. So again, the matter of inclusiveness for the democratic process, as well as the fact that in general, cooperating with fellow civil society organizations is always considered useful for intel sharing, info sharing, and knowledge sharing as well. So it is always considered an added value for any campaign that one may want to launch or join. I hope I stick to the 2 minutes, not sure about it. Apologies if not, thanks.
No worries.
And if others want to complement, please.
Sure, I said, okay, I see Andrea raising fingers. So if you have comments, feel free also to put them in the chat box, and we'll raise them. Now, third session is the ULEX project. So I let either Eli or G take the floor.
Thank you, Vladimir. I'm gonna take the floor and just a snippet of the discussion, because it is a big topic. Like the topic we are discussing today is huge, and we talked about the ecology of social movements and how to build capacity towards working across difference. And like an hour and 15 minutes talking about that is definitely not enough. But to give you some snippets, so we did talk about, we did a short presentation about how we understand, how we think about movement building as a ULEX project, what kind of tensions might arise in terms of different strategies, approaches we have to social change, to engagement in movements, and also different phases, different identities we take as activists and organizers. And then we kind of we explored what is the experience in the room. So what is the experience existing there in the room of obstacles, what prevents us from being able to work across difference, and what helps us to do it. And I'm just going to name some of the things. What we've been discussing is that definitely valuing different strategies and seeing limitations of our own strategies is something really useful and helping to support a broad change. But the question arises, how do we do that in practice? And we definitely did not have time to exchange a lot of practices. So it's interesting to hear about from what you discussed in the SOLIDAR discussion. I will be very happy to hear more about like practical things. How do we do it? We did talk about trust and relationship building, that trust is so often an issue, and that we need to invest in relationship building also like on the movement level. We talked about sitting with discomfort and how important that is. We talked about opening and trying out new tools and strategies and how that can increase our capacity, often in quite a surprising way. We did also talk about the emotional aspect of being involved in activism and how we can take care of the emotional aspect and keeping ourselves going. We did talk, we raised questions around coordination. Do we really need to coordinate our social movements? And we did explore also how useful it is to be in tension and to be in conflict and to engage in conflict, and how that can be sparkling ideas and making change happen. And that's probably more as broadly it. There was more, but to stick to 2 minutes, that's probably that.
Perfect. In any case, this is an ongoing process, so if there wasn't enough time here, we'll try to open new spaces for more time. So now I go without further delay to Shenna.
Thank you very much, and also to the group that joined. I first would like to start that a lot of what Eli mentioned has really resonated also within the exchange within the intersectionalism breakout group. And perhaps to first feedback on some of the sharings and reflections. One of the important things is how in our organizations, in our universities, in the communities we belong to, and also in our personal lives, how we need to uproot the systems that create and perpetuate environmental and social injustices. And so in order to achieve system change, we really need to challenge the structures of oppression and also to challenge also our own privileges, and how do we use these privileges to liberate instead of perpetuating the cycles of oppression. So first thing that I also shared from the Friends of the Earth perspective is the need to also look within our ways of working in our organizations, because some of this in fact are also internalized, and also as individuals recognizing that some of these behaviors of white supremacy is integrated along the way, and also acknowledging that each one have lived experiences, and also that we are on a journey towards demanding for a more fair society within this racist, capitalist, sexist, patriarchal capitalist system. And so, so segueing to that, how as we are all part of, or most of us are part of civil society and the social, wider social movement, we need to recognize that, yeah, we have to start also the work from within. And of course, that complements how much we question the society in general, and also what theories of change are applicable in the struggles that we would like to push forward. And one common thread is to really amplify the needs and the struggles of the most disproportionately impacted individuals or groups. And also, yeah, how to build alliance and build relationships. And this is, in a way, part of the mutual learning process, and yeah, how to strike the balance of reflection, because we can do a lot of this, but also to complement it with action. So that could mean also putting it into our strategies or policies, or how do we operationalize our work towards intersectional justice by embedding it in our campaigns. So I have also shared that, yeah, the importance of solidarity, internationalist solidarity work is key, because there are so many human rights and environmental defenders that are, the lives are being at risk. And this is because they also promote and protect their communities, as well as pushing for significant changes. And of course, the power holders never liked such a challenging approach. And so to make sure that we promote people-led solutions and to go forward towards feminist, just transition, agroecology, food sovereignty. So yeah, there are many different elements of organizing approach, which needs to be also more anti-oppressive, and that we really on a daily basis in our social change work to confront the systems of power and privilege. And so also acknowledging that we cannot do this alone, that we really have to work in alliances and also towards system change. And also there were so many different input that has been shared. So I'm really thankful of this, that, you know, how we can also use capacity building, but yeah, that's not enough. Capacity building to transform the structures of our organization towards more intersectional justice. And that, yeah, a lot of organizations and movements would really need to also embed gender justice, also with the LGBTQ, and also people with disabilities. And so really going beyond the usual umbrella work that we have been doing. I think we only have one element of disagreement. That's the, yeah, what the elements of the definition of intersectionality. And then areas for future reflection. Sorry, I just have to really make sure this gets through. Institutional point of view, what's the role of institutions and how to facilitate this interaction with the broader civil society movement and to really create and enable spaces, especially putting forward the leadership of the BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, communities, and being able to ask for help also within our organizations if we are somehow clueless and what the power and privilege, for example, means. And finally, one of the barriers is, we need to avoid tokenism, and that we really have to strive towards real inclusion. And I think that's mostly what has been raised.
Thank you, Shenna. So I see that it went from self-questioning the organizations to even providing some solutions on how to open up the horizons. Thank you. Now, I don't know if Floriant prefers to take the floor. Yeah, Floriant on the French case. And
thank you, Vladimir. So in our group, we spoke about the different forms of engagement, asking ourselves what had changed during the pandemic and what were the long-term trends. There were three big issues that were discussed. The first one was about altruistic individualism. Our group agreed on this first observation that engagement was much more individualistic. People want to find solutions for themselves, and individualism has become a level of engagement. And what is reinforced by social medias, of course, but solidarity is still there and at a very high level. Even in those forms of individualistic engagement. So that's confirmed a trend that researchers call altruistic individualism. That is to say, you are engaged to help people, but you are also looking for your own pleasure and own satisfaction. The second point was about associations as intermediate bodies producing trust. And we also agreed on the fact that public authorities often do not see associations as intermediate bodies between citizens and the state, but they are intermediate bodies. And we share the fact that associations in France are considered as a place that is trust is being built. Associations are a school of participative democracy, and of course they are organized differently on different kind of territories. If you live in a rural or in an urban territory, you won't have the same experience in an association, perhaps a more collaborative culture between organizations and with public authorities in rural territories than in big cities. One problem that we discussed here was that the engagement and its contribution to democracy and society is not recognized because it's not even known, and research has a lot to bring to this recognition. And the third big issue was about representativity. We pointed this issue of representativity. Who represents civil society? That's perhaps clearer about formal engagement and associations than about informal engagement. And this issue goes also with a kind of individualization of representation. And then the question of legitimacy is questioned. But the problem is that people don't always feel that they have the possibility to intervene and make a change in society through associations, and that associations suffer from a kind of distrust because they can be considered by some as official bodies. And that is an important point, because that should make associations think about the diversity that they mobilize in their volunteers and especially in their governances. there, the question of yellow vest was also shared, and we asked ourselves if it changed something in engagement. Of course, it's too soon to know. The positive thing is that yellow vest movement brought hope and empowerment for a lot of people who were not represented through associations, but as it didn't brought transformation over protest, it also fed distrust and kind of deception, and it also introduced in activism a kind of conservatism or populist vision, for instance, concerning migrants or vaccination. And as Richard Young said, we have to be careful not to idealize any form of engagement. After that, and that was in this point of in this issue of representativity. We also spoke about liberalization of hate speech, of the importation of anti-wokeism from American alt-right as a new national sport in France, but is criticizing activists instead of struggling for their causes that are right. And the problem is that political perceptions are not connected to realities, and that NGOs have a lot of difficulties to cope with those critics. And knowledge is definitely important there to help NGOs in their advocacy. And as a conclusion, we spoke about three big issues for research. First one would be to invest history of engagement, of relation between public authorities and civil society organizations. This history that has not been written yet at the European scale. That's the first point. A second point is about a state of play of engagement in Europe that would need, of course, comparative law research to have a framework to study engagement, but also comparative studies in order to tell how many volunteers do we have in Europe, how many associations or civil society organizations, that what would be the term that should be studied. And the last thing is about qualitative research that are needed in order to recognize the socio-political function of associations and their contributions to society and democracy. And I just like to say that the Institut Français du Monde Associatif will discuss those 3 points in a working group about contribution of NPOs and volunteering to democracy in Europe last year.
Thank you a lot, Floriant, and thank you all for the hosts for the work you've done and the discussions you've led successfully. So since we were too much on time, and this is not something very usual for us at ECF, we needed to be a bit delayed. I'm apologizing for this, but we have some more minutes to listen to Jean Robert, who is Vice President of the European Civic Forum, and who will try to draw some conclusions and open new chapters for the next European Civic Academies and next spaces for cooperation among us. So Jean Robert, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hopefully I will not do all this because it's already 6:05. I am completely panicked by the fact to have to conclude, to tell you the truth. Not to conclude, but to propose some elements for the conclusion. So I will probably do it in a very unsatisfactory way for everybody. Maybe the first reason why it's so difficult to propose conclusion is that the agenda that we try to tackle this year with these 3 sessions is obviously too big and too complex to be answered. So after the 3 sessions, obviously we did not answer it. So why I am a little bit optimist is the fact that if we did not answer the questions, maybe that we succeeded in ask ourselves the right ones, which is already quite an issue because there are so many questions that we can ask and try to discuss together. I want to draw our collective attention on the fact that our societies are so complex, so diversified, that we have, as a result, many vulnerabilities for the people they experience, many inequalities, many reasons to be left aside, many reasons to be demoralized by the situations that we live. And it would be too easy to think that just because we have a good vision of this or that question, we have the right path to build the solutions. I think that we have, in a way, to find, and it's not so easy, a simple way to be happy by a result. When should we be happy because we got a result? I think that, and it's something ECF is doing regularly. It is when we think to an issue, when we think to a fight, when we think to a mobilization, when we think to an issue, we think it with some words. We look to the issue with the word equality. We look to the issue with the word solidarity. We look to the issue with the word democracy. We look to the issue with inclusiveness, inclusive societies, inclusive approaches. We know that it doesn't solve everything, but when we have some kind of green lights with these four words, we think that we go collectively in the right direction. And I think that our debate from today, as the debate from the two last sessions, confirms that we need some kinds of words and benchmark, simple ones, which really help us look to the issues we have in front of us. We are in societies where we are asked to be in competition one with other all the time. We are with inequalities, with really put the fact that we are a victim of this competition in many aspects. Any fight which make little progress to these issues of inequality, which really build on solidarity, democracy, and which contribute to inclusiveness, is an asset for the next step. And I think that when we are going to think to the next university years, we are again going to look for questions too big to be answered, but we are going to try to have questions which are worth thinking about, even if the answers are difficult to reach. And if we do so, I hope that we are useful for our community of activists. So I will stop here, and knowing that we have more questions and answers at the end of this 3 hours, but in fact, at any moment of our activist life. So I wanted to share this with you. Rafaela, President of ECF, you want to add a word?
No, only to say that, yes, that we need to discuss a lot, and it's nice to discuss together. It's interesting to think what we have in common and also to discuss what we disagree. And I think that one of the best element of this academy and in general of our work is to put together generations which are different and approaches which are different and struggles which are not always the same, because we are lucky. There are a lot of new generation struggle and new countries which come on the stage with wonderful campaigns and fight for democracy and rights. And so let's go on and let's keep us in touch, not only in Zoom, but also in our daily life for solidarity, for asking support to our campaign, for sharing our knowledge, and for providing us as much as information about what's happening in our movements, in our associations, in our country, because this exchange really is food for our brain and for our activism. So thank you very, 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 very much.
Also, I think that we have to give all together a special thank and clap to Giada, to Vladimir, to Shaima, I don't
Camila.
have what's the name,
Camila,
and also to
Alexandrina.
have a special thought to Alexandrina, who could not join us this afternoon, but who already put me 2 emails to ask if everything is
okay. We have a
thank
lot
you
of people to
our team.
us.
Thank you to our team.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
And
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
keep in contact. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao, 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 ciao.
Okay, ciao.